When I meet with couples preparing to be married, I usually show them the traditional wedding vows. Because when they get in front of the altar and a crowd of people, it's really hard to pay attention or know what you're saying. And so I want them to know what they're committing to. And I ask them, are you still down with this, even though you know exactly what you're promising? So here are the traditional wedding vows. I, in the presence of God and these witnesses, take you to be my wife or husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parts us. And I pledge you my faithfulness. And I always share that this is a picture of faithfulness. I want them to think about faithfulness. And I ask, do you know anybody who's been married 50 years? And usually they know someone who's been married 50 years or 60. Or at least in my tenure, the longest that I'm aware of in our church was 75 years in a marriage. And that gives you a picture of, oh my goodness, that is faithfulness. That is to love one another even when you don't like each other. Or to love one another when there's an infant crying at 3 a.m. for dinner and you do paper, rock, scissors to find out who's going to get up and change the diaper. To make this commitment is to love someone when at some point maybe you lose a job and there's financial hardship, or when one of you has cancer, or one of you is near death. You're committing to love in all circumstances, and that's faithfulness. Throughout the Bible, there is a consistent metaphor that comes up regularly, the metaphor of marriage and the relationship of God and his people. It's like a marriage, a bridegroom and the bride, or God and his people Israel are like a husband and wife, like that kind of relationship. And it's the same tenets as any marriage. There's exclusivity, there is commitment, there is trust, there is selfless love. The word covenant means a binding promise. So if we talk about the marriage covenant, it's the same as God's covenant with his people Israel. It is a binding promise that you commit to love one another in all of these circumstances and conditions. And so often in Scripture there is this metaphor of God and his people like a marriage. So we come to Hosea, the prophet. He's probably the prophet that you would least want to be. So if there's a room full of kids and you say, hey kids, if you could be any prophet, which would you be? Don't raise your hand for Hosea. He was sometimes known as the deathbed prophet because he prophesied near the end of the northern kingdom of Israel when Assyria was near to decimating the northern kingdom. And the dominant metaphor in his message was one of marriage, like we're talking about. We see that in Hosea 3, verse 1. You get a picture of this marriage relationship. Why don't you read this with me? The Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again. She has had other lovers and has been unfaithful to you. Keep on loving her the way the Lord loves the people of Israel. This is true, even though the Israelites worship other gods. If you want to read Hosea, it's rated M for mature. And you want to kind of take a deep breath before you dive into it. To be brutally honest, God told Hosea to marry a prostitute. So he calls him to be a prophet. He says, marry a prostitute, someone who will be unfaithful to you, and you're going to have kids with her. Not only will you have kids with her, but you're going to give them these names like Lo Ami, which means not my people, and Lo Ruhama, which means no mercy. Those are great names. So if you're pregnant, you're thinking about names, look to Hosea, be like, hey, no mercy, make your bed. It's time to get up, not my people. But every time that their names were spoken, it was like a little sermon. It was like a message. Their names were the message. And so poor Hosea is given the call as a prophet where his life is like the sermon. His life is the object lesson. Every time somebody would see the prophet Hosea and they knew of his circumstance with Gomer, his wife, every time they saw him, they would see his message. It's explicit. It's very honest. And the metaphor is that it's a picture of Yahweh's relationship with his people. Hosea was like the Lord, and his wife Gomer was like the people of Israel. Always wandering, unfaithful. And so in Hosea we see, and it's real, there's almost you can hear pain in his prophecy because he's experiencing it just as God does. And you hear this longing for his wife to come back home. You hear pain and hurt of betrayal in his voice. It's very raw. Here's some of the relationship language that we hear throughout Hosea. This is like a sampling. Throughout the 14 chapters of Hosea, it's this kind of relationship language where God says, they have forsaken me. My people have forgotten me. They've rejected the Lord. They've left their God. They've strayed from me. They've refused to return to me. And I think in different ways, different circumstances, we can all kind of understand and maybe even feel a relationship that's been strained like this. You see it. You feel it in your gut. So the question is, does this have anything to do with us today? You might think, well, I haven't committed adultery, and certainly, have I cheated on God? I've never cheated on God. It might be kind of hard for us to access this prophet Hosea, to understand what he's talking about. I've known some people who have been in the life of prostitution. And you might wonder, well, why would anybody do that? And I can tell you that no one, at least that I know, chooses to do this because, this is going to be a great career choice, or I'm going to love this. In my experience, every time a life of prostitution comes out of a place of desperation, that someone is in just such a bad situation, dire straits, or abuse, or on the margin, or poverty. There's some sort of desperation that drives it. And they feel like there's no other option. We get a little bit of a glimpse. I want you to see, because if you, on the surface, you just think, well, prostitute, you kind of have this idea, but I want you to look a little bit deeper into the mind and even the heart. So we hear from Gomer, who was the prostitute, but also Hosea's wife. Hosea 2, verse 5, and she says this, if you'd read with me. She said, I will chase after my lovers. They give me food and water. They give me wool and linen. They give me wine and olive oil. What I want you to pay attention to is kind of there's sort of a conditional nature here, like a conditional clause that she says, I will give, and then notice that there's something in return. She gets something back. So I'll chase after other lovers. Then they will give me food and water. They'll give me basic security. They'll give me what I need. There's kind of this sense of, if I give, then I get in return. It's conditional. And a lot of times that's what's underneath the transaction of that life. If I just give them this, then I will get something in return. If I just give, then I'll get money, or then I'll get security, or then I'll get status, or then I'll get affection, or then I'll get self-worth. It seems really counterintuitive, but if somebody's in a desperate situation, they'll do anything to be validated, to have some sort of value or worth, even if it is something that seems outside the realm of what you'd ever do. You just are desperate for someone to pay attention to you. And so too in Israel, if I just do this, then I'll get this. God isn't coming through with this, and so maybe I have to go over here to get it. I have to give to get something back. We live in a world of conditions, so we're used to this. And so too, Gomer lived with conditions. So too, this is how we are unfaithful to God. We give ourselves to someone else or something else, trying to get what only God can give. If I just give my life to my job, to my work, then I will get money, and then I will be happy. If I just give like a flirtatious glance, then I will get her attention. Then he'll pay attention to me. Look at me. If I just give them what they want, then they'll give me their affection. If I just give my good deeds, if I just do good things, then I'm going to get good karma, because what goes around comes around. If I just give my love and my devotion to him or to her, then they will love me back. And we live in conditions. We put conditions on love, and we try to earn value. And we chase after others, looking from them what only God can give, because we're desperate for security, for attention, for love, for value. That's how you're unfaithful. That's the temptation that you have. I want you to take a look at the traditional wedding vows again. And I want you to notice that there is nothing in the traditional wedding vows that is conditional. No one gets in front of the altar and says, I will take you to be my husband if you do this. Or I will love you as long as you... There's nothing like that in the vows. It's just, I take you. And it's not only that, it's I take you no matter what the conditions are. Sickness or health, better or worse, richer or poor, I just take you. And I choose to love you. There is nothing conditional in these wedding vows. Same with God. There is nothing conditional in our relationship with the living God. He says, I just take you. No ifs, no ands or buts. No, I'll love you if you love me back. Just, I take you. Have you ever seen the comic strip Family Circus? Anybody? Like maybe if you're old, you know that comic? Just raise your hand. Okay, I'm going to check the average age of people raising their hands. Henley, you know Family Circus? Okay, good. The 3-year-old knows Family Circus. That's good. It's a comic strip. If you don't know, it's like an old comic strip. It does not in circulation anymore. But there would regularly be, it was known for what we'd call like the dotted line. There'd be this boy in the family, and it would like track wherever he's gone. It'd almost be like a little map, and the dotted line would follow everywhere he went. And sometimes it would be like in circles, you know, like if you're a kid, you just kind of meander a little bit, but then it would follow him, and he'd get into some trouble over here, and then you'd follow the dotted line, and the little boy would go over here, and there'd be like a rock through a window, and then you'd go over here, and he'd maybe get into some candy, and there's wrappers all over the place, and then the dotted line would go over here, and there'd be some mischief over here he'd get into, and you just follow the dotted line, and you follow the little boy all around everywhere he's been and everything he's done, and it was kind of funny. What if there was a dotted line for your life? And someone could follow you everywhere you've wandered off, everything you've done, when it was behind closed doors, you didn't think anybody could see. But what if there was a dotted line for your life? Actually, there is. It's called artificial intelligence. They know everything, everywhere you've been. You can't hide. And what if What if God could see everywhere that you've been, every dotted line? And how would you feel if he saw the most embarrassing places that you've wandered off to, the most shameful things? And in reality, you know, like he knows. He doesn't need a dotted line. In fact, he was with you. He saw it. He knows. But we kind of trick ourselves into thinking, well, it's in my mind. I thought it. Or I just did a quick glance at the screen and nobody sees that. Or I was over here and nobody knows me over there. But what is it that you have done or thought or seen that's so embarrassing that you'd never want God to see it? In the season of Lent, we're going deep, a deep diagnosis of sin. So we're not just talking about surface level. We're trying to get past when you do the confession of sins earlier in the service where you just kind of go through the motions. We're trying to go deeper. So I know this is not pleasant, but where is it in your life, the dotted line, that you are so ashamed, embarrassed of? Your pastor has some dotted lines that he is ashamed, that he's embarrassed about. I have things I'm embarrassed about. You do too. And we have to look at it, stare at it, acknowledge it. God knows, he sees. But then what do we do about it? Where do we go with it when we have been unfaithful and wandering off, when we've hurt others or hurt God himself? Where do we go with that? At the end of Hosea, we get kind of the final appeal. The final chapter is chapter 14, and Hosea sort of ends on this note. It can be summarized really in one word: return. Israel, return to the Lord your God. So you get this appeal from the bridegroom. Israel, come back home. Come back. You've been unfaithful. I've been faithful, but I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. You've left, but I'll never leave. Just come back home. And there's the repetition of that word, return. And that's the final appeal. After you've seen where you've been, where you've wandered, after you've looked at the dotted line, after Israel is confronted with her sin, there's still the appeal to return, to come back home. And you might think, well, that's difficult. If you've been in a relationship where there's been betrayal, how do you return? Because there's been some real hurt. And you can't just cover it up. You can't just gloss it over and say, well, that's okay, I'll forget about it. So how do you return to God? Well, he doesn't just cover it up or gloss it over. He does something about it so that you can return. Jesus Christ has made a way for you to come back home. We're nearing Good Friday in just under 2 weeks. And when all of our wandering and dotted lines wander all over the place, Jesus makes a beeline to the cross. And it's here that all of those embarrassing places that you've been, and thoughts and words, and all of the shameful things that you thought, no one will ever take me, God will never take me, they are put here and heaped on him and hoisted on his shoulders. This is how God deals with the return. This is how he takes you back. There's no other way. You couldn't come back otherwise, but he made a way for you to come back home. And he loved you in this way with no conditions, where Jesus can say in sickness and in health, doesn't matter what condition, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, he has gone to the cross for you. And he can say even more than the wedding vows say, where you say, until death parts us, it goes beyond that. Nothing will part you from him, not even death. So hear the appeal today of your God. Pull out that most embarrassing place, the dotted line. Drop it at the foot of the cross and hear his voice call you again. Return, Israel, return to the Lord your God. Come back home. I've made a way. Just come back home and return. Amen.